Thank you everyone for being here. Today's talk is given by Henry Kvinge, I hope I pronounced that right, of University of Washington and Pacific Northwest National Laboratories. Henry is a long-time, I hope I can call him a friend, certainly an associate.
Yeah, of course.
Who I knew back at NGA. His research interests include AI security, the science of deep learning, and the application of pure mathematics to neural networks. And he's going to be presenting today on symmetry and machine learning and why it matters. So, Henry, before we get started, one question: would you prefer people interrupt you with questions or hold them to the end?
Yeah. No, I have my two monitors, so I can actually see everyone while I'm presenting. So just interrupt me. This is meant to be pretty informal.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, Henry, take it away.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mark, for the invitation, and I'm excited to be able to come present today. So. This presentation is going to be like a little bit of a mishmash of a few topics. I've been trying to put together presentations recently that like kind of survey the field a little more broadly rather than go into gross detail of just the particular things I've done. So because of that, some of these slides were originally aimed at a math audience. So if something doesn't make sense, just say something, or if you don't want to do that, it probably won't matter in a few slides anyway. So thank you for your understanding. So the talk structure is going to have two parts. The focus is symmetry, but I'm going to talk about two ways that symmetry appears in machine learning, and by machine learning I usually mean deep learning. One is symmetries in the data. This is perhaps the more familiar setting, and the other one is symmetries in the neural network architectures themselves. So invariance and equivariance, fundamental topics in a lot of places. They're sort of central ideas in mathematics and also physics because they capture the idea that there are certain data structures, physical systems, mathematical objects where you can perform some sorts of transformations on them and either they don't change or the function that whose domain they are changes in a very controlled way with respect to those transformations. So to give an example, I can have, say, an image classifier, and maybe I can do some things to my data type, like I can my data type maybe is images, and I can rotate those images around, and I can put the rotated image through the neural network. And for this particular task, a dog remains a dog even when I rotate the image. And so I would hope that the classifier doesn't change its prediction just because of these transformations. And of course, these are things that humans can see right past. I would not fool you into thinking that the picture on the bottom here is a bird just because it's upside down. So invariance is a special case of equivariance. And what this basically says is that a map respects some symmetry action. And so the way we can picture this is I have this grid shape, and moving downward corresponds to say rotation, and moving to the right corresponds to applying a neural network. And the idea is if the neural network is equivariant with respect to this particular transformation, which is rotation, then it doesn't matter what path I take. I can apply the neural network and then rotate the output, and that's the same thing I get as rotating the input and applying the neural network. And you can imagine a lot of cases outside of classification where this would be an important thing. This is kind of a stupid example that I made a few years ago when generative AI was not quite as good, where there was some model that made images look like cartoons. And in this application, maybe it's not so important that you get the same thing in either direction, but you can imagine that in some instance, like say object detection or segmentation, you'd sort of hope that your model wouldn't drastically change its prediction segmentation mask besides just the rotation component if you rotated and put it through, as opposed to putting the images through the segmenter and then rotating. So this is a nice property, and it comes up in a lot of places. These are all computer vision examples. But most data types have some type of symmetry to them. So images, translation, rotation, reflection. In most cases, it does depend on the content because 6s become 9s when you rotate them. Audio has some things. Obviously, graph. The way we represent graphs in a computer, often we have to order the vertices, but that ordering is arbitrary, so you need to be able to account for that, and graph neural networks do this. And then there's other things as well. You might care about like sets and more exotic data types, or maybe not so exotic. For example, point clouds and molecular models are I would not call those exotic anymore, but they also have their symmetries that are often more complicated than the ones here. So you can imagine that it might be nice to make sure that your model respects symmetries, or is invariant, equivariant, whatever makes sense in your problem setting. Most of the examples I'll use actually are invariant networks. And so the question is, like, how would you build that in? And there's basically two approaches. Well, maybe there's more than two, but I'll talk about two today. The one is data augmentation, or in the very big data limit, maybe you don't do any augmentation at all, but you just have a lot of data, and that's enough for the model. You close your eyes and hope the model learns what it should learn. And then there's also these things called equivariant architectures, where you build your model so that the function you learn is by definition has to be equivariant. And so here in this example, this is from the GitHub repo for a general E2 equivariant steerable CNNs. You can see here that this is, so you have some input here. You can look at the feature map. The input's rotating, so is the feature map. But the feature map is doing some things that are, has some changes besides just the rotation. And in fact, if you stabilize this rotating circle, you can see that it's sort of morphing and changing, indicating that it's actually extracting different features beyond just the rotation when it does its feature extraction. So when people build equivariant architectures, they don't want this to be the case. They want really the only change to be with respect to that transformation. And so these folks who built this particular model that was equivariant to rotation of images, you can see here that in that case, the feature map is changing because it's rotating, but if you stabilize it, it actually doesn't change. So, and so the way this is usually done in practice, or at least used to be done, maybe people are doing different things now, is that you say, okay, I have many layers, and rather than trying to make the whole thing equivariant all at once, because that's complicated, we don't have a good classification scheme for equivariant models, nonlinear deep equivariant models. I'm just going to make every layer equivariant. And if invariance is my primary goal, which for this CNN example it is, having many equivariant layers that sort of compress the dimension down till you only have one, say, spatial dimension left is enough to get you to be at least approximately invariant. You sort of control the amount of change to your image by having equivariance at each layer, and then at some point there's no more dimensions for things to change it. So a CNN is a great example, probably the most famous example of an equivariant network. And this, of course, is equivariant to translation of imagery, so that if I learn to recognize a dog in the top left corner of an image, I don't necessarily have to learn to recognize it in the bottom right, in the bottom left, in the top right, et cetera, which you can imagine that would be maybe not so efficient. And it's worth noting that, like, when you actually engineer these things, they're never actually equivariant on the nose, because at some point there is an interpolation, because images are, in the way that people usually treat them is as being continuous, but in reality they're not continuous, and so you can check this. There's some nice work that looks at just how equivariant CNNs and other related architectures are. So here's another nice visualization. This is a CNN, a standard CNN. I'm performing translation on the input, and you can see that the intermediate layers kind of change in a predictable way. That is pretty much, except at the edges where you have some edge effects, is just the corresponding translation, so equivariance. Towards the end, things get to be very the discretization becomes such that it's not really clear if this is what you want, but a comparison to a case of rotation where the model is not equivariant to that, you can see that this seems to be there seems to be a lot more variation in this besides the transformation. So one can make a few simple observations, and we've already made one of these. So the first is that if you have two functions, you can think of them as layers for our purposes, and the first one's invariant to a some sort of symmetry transformation, then their composition's invariant. So this motivates why you might want to do this layer by layer. Another point, though, that'll come up later is that you can certainly have two functions, neither of which are invariant, but when you compose them, the resulting function is invariant. And it's not too hard to cook up little toy examples of this. And then maybe just a note to say, so I'm originally a representation theorist, which is more or less the mathematical study of symmetry. But in that setting, everyone does everything in the linear case. So it's been really interesting to think about deep learning and symmetry, because deep learning models are famously not linear. And first of all, a lot of the theorems go out the window and you have to start from scratch. And also just checking whether something is equivariant or invariant for a nonlinear function is hard, because with linear, then you can just check things on a basis, like the usual game you play in linear algebra. But for nonlinear things, that's not possible. And it could be, conceivably, it could be equivariant in one neighborhood and not equivariant in another. So we took a lot of these questions and wrote a paper about it. So most of the work in this field looks at, proposes architectures. I was just interested in, should we be doing this? Are models that don't have equivariant or invariance built into their architecture, are they approximately invariant anyway? Do the models learn this? If they do learn it, how do they learn it? Is it the same way that we engineer it? So we looked into this and tried to draw some conclusions. And so we developed, one of the main contributions of this work was to develop a metric that would allow us to measure equivariance and invariance empirically for a model on a data distribution. Surprisingly, this hadn't really been done. There were a few cases where people tried to do something like this, but in each case they were primarily interested in showing their method was the best, which, that's fine. But because of that, the conclusion was always the same, which was that my method does create invariant networks and no one else does. So we wanted to sort of take a third-party approach to this, and we were not proposing anything. We just sort of wanted to see what we could find. And we want to make this agnostic to where you are measuring invariance or equivariance, because one of the questions, of course, is sort of where does this arise in the network? So I won't go into this detail on this. I guess I will leave you with the perhaps unsatisfactory comment that it's exactly what you would think it would be. So there's an equation for equivariance. Says that if I apply a transformation and then, in this case, my neural network to input, that's the same as applying my neural network and then some transformation. This metric just basically measures to what extent that equality holds. And of course, you need to average over the data distribution and also over the different symmetry operations you can perform. So roughly, it comes down to comparing these two terms on a bunch of examples. In this case, I only have a single example, but you can imagine doing it for a bunch of examples, both for and then also for different transformations. And what we found was, I think, was kind of interesting. So maybe one thing is you might expect that and this was done a few years ago, so there's no transformers here. It would be interesting to look at that, but we have not gone back and done that. This is all CNN. So blue is a regular CNN. C8 CNN is invariant to rotations by 45 degrees, which is what the data was rotated by. I think this was an MNIST example, but I could be wrong. But the big takeaway was that surprisingly, like a CNN that was just trained with augmentation did pretty well. It was a little bit less invariant. It's had a similar accuracy. It was a lot less complicated to engineer. But the places where it actually the point in the network at which it captured invariance was very, very different. So for instance, when we engineer equivariant layers in an equivariant network, the way we do it, like I said, was that we take a bunch of equivariant layers and stack them together. So then we have control sort of the whole pipeline. The CNN, when it learns to be invariant, in this case, the rotation, it definitely does not do that throughout the whole network. It starts out, it's very not invariant in the earlier convolutional layers. And it's reasonable to ask, like, is this even possible given its architecture? And it turns out it can. Like, you can, if you go in and pick your filters in such a way, you can engineer it that it's approximately equivariant to these layers. But then when you train with gradient descent in sort of the normal way, you certainly don't find this. And instead what you find is that so at a very high level, what seems to happen is the model doesn't worry about invariance at all through most of the network, and then in sort of the final layer, it collapses everything down. And so, I think that's interesting that, sort of nature, termed loosely, finds it a very different way than we've chosen to do things when we want to sort of engineer things by hand. And there's probably a bitter lesson here somewhere.
Question.
Yeah.
Was this measured on the training set or the test set?
This is test, I believe, but actually test and train ended up being very, very similar.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, good question. So you could ask them, like, what's the value of these things? And this is more recent work. There's a workshop paper on it, but it hasn't found a final home yet. We looked at, like, okay, maybe from the perspective of just looking at empirical invariance or equivariance on a very small data set with a small model, and a sufficient amount of data, like you don't see that much benefit. What about the scaling curves? What are the scale? How does equivariance in change the scaling laws? And so we are in the process of looking at that right now. All we have is toy examples, as you can see, because the word MNIST is appearing here. But so far, what we've seen is that scaling law, including equivariance, seems to shift the scaling laws. So if you look at these curves, okay, they're a little noisy, so they don't look exactly like straight lines. But to me, they sort of look like they're mostly probably have the same slope, maybe not exactly. It's unclear whether that would average out, but it certainly is the case. They seem to be the scaling curves seem to be shifted down, and in this case, maybe the salient fact to notice is so SO2 is continuous rotations, and the scaling curve shifts down the most when you actually match the equivariance to the actual transformation of the data that you care about. In this case, where you're also including reflections or flips, this pink line, which corresponds exactly to those type of transformations, is the one with the most favorable scaling curve. So this is very early research. It has been backed up by another paper that came out by Taco Cohen from Qualcomm, who showed similar things. And so, maybe the story is that if you have sufficient data, and you're not worried about, sort of far enough along the scaling curves that, in terms of data at least, that shifting these things down a little bit is not going to have a big impact on model performance, then it doesn't really matter. Maybe in other regimes it does. The thing that I'm interested in now is like, how does the complexity of the symmetries impact things? Because all I've showed you so far is very simple symmetries, translation and rotation, essentially. But you can certainly find cases where the symmetry is a lot more complex. So some takeaways from this section. I think from the perspective of accuracy alone, augmentation is probably better in almost all applications. There might be some very niche things where you really need to make sure that you have these properties in a network. There are probably some data and compute efficiency aspects to things that we didn't consider, but cases where this might be useful. And in fact, I think that what we're going to see, so there's a parallel story. So in computer vision, right, we started out with CNNs, and now people use vision transformers. That has less equivariance built into it. It doesn't have the translation, but they seem to work well at least at certain scales. There's an interesting story that's playing out in molecular modeling, where so if you have if you're modeling a molecule, you can rotate whatever way the coordinates that you have for each of the atoms, and you have an equally valid representation. So there's a more complicated symmetry in play. There's three-dimensional rotation. And people originally always used equivariant models there to capture things. But I guess AlphaFold 3, I've been told, is not equivariant. So maybe we've reached that point where we have enough data or compute where the equivariance is going to recede. And I sort of expect this to happen in anywhere where people are using data with symmetries. People might start out with equivariance, and then at some point, like, we'll have enough data and we won't need it anymore, and it'll recede into the distance. And then the final comment is just that the way models learn invariance is very different than the way that we engineer it. And for those interested in like the science of deep learning side of things, there's probably interesting questions to ask there. Okay, so that's the end of my first part. Maybe I'll pause in case there's any questions.
I had a sort of a question, is if you
thought
about how it relates to the model capacity also, because like, especially you were saying it gets more data. You don't need these as much built in, but the more data is in terms of the model capacity or related relative to. And there's one more point that I was going to ask about to prompt that was, when you were saying that the model doesn't learn invariance or equivariance necessarily layer by layer when you put in the augmentations. But you can I'd imagine that if you shrank the models, that it would have to a little bit more, that it wouldn't have the capacity to learn 8 different representations for different translations and then collapse them down, although the final accuracy might be worse. But I was wondering if you thought about how it relates, or if there's any like way to relate them a little more formally. I don't know.
Yeah, actually, those are great points. Okay, so maybe for the first one, I don't know. It certainly makes intuitive sense. I want to run some parameter. So I showed you scaling curves for data only. We have not run ones for parameters, but I think that would be really interesting and like the obvious other half of the story that should be told. So I don't have too much to say about it other than to say your prediction makes sense. And in fact, like connecting to your second point, there is work that shows sort of the opposite of our conclusion in terms of learned symmetries, where they show some researchers out of UC Santa Barbara showed that for really small toy problems, they were able to get the model to learn sort of the same filter patterns, Gabor filters, and things like that. That you would learn that we tend to engineer into these things or something like that. I don't remember some of the details, but basically the point of the paper was like you actually do converge to these nice representations that we would have engineered, and maybe that fits with your point that they were doing things on a really small level, and that perhaps there are two regimes: one in which you have enough capacity to play this like collapsing game. And another where you just have just enough capacity that you are sort of forced by the optimization into doing things in the way that like mathematicians would try to design them. So that's a really nice point. We will look into that.
Okay, thanks.
Any other thoughts? Okay, if not, I will jump on to the other work. So this other work is from a team at PNNL, UPenn, and now Thomson Reuters. It's mostly Charles Godfrey's work, so I will credit him now. So I talked a little bit about data, symmetries in data. I want to talk about symmetries in architectures. So here's a very vanilla picture of a neural network architecture. I don't need to show this to anyone on this call, but at the joint math meetings I did. And so, okay, we're just going to picture like the standard thing where you have nonlinearities interspersed with affine transformations, and we'll just mostly think about ReLU in a few places. I'll mention some other activations. Okay, so what is a symmetry of a network? So suppose you have some network architecture with n learnable weights. You can think of the weights then as a vector. And the symmetry of the architecture is just a transformation of the weights that I can apply where I get the exact same function back. So I take my network, I do something to the weights, and even though the weights are now different, the network is exactly the same. So let me illustrate this with a picture. So in pretty much any nonlinearity that acts pointwise, one thing you can do is you can take your fully connected layer, nonlinearity fully connected layer, and what I can do is I can permute the way that the well, basically insert a permutation here, which in the case of a fully connected layer would amount to like permuting the rows or columns or however you're doing your multiplication, as long as I unpermute afterwards. Because each one of these individual nonlinearities acts the same and independently, and so I can do this sort of mixing procedure. And so if I do these permutations, what things will look like in practice is that I will have for the nonlinearity I'm doing this on, the weights before will have some sort of permutation of rows or columns, and the weights after will have some sort of permutation of rows and columns. And this is really, really simple. And when we noted this, we said, well, that's kind of nice mathematically, but what can you do with that? And the point of this talk is going to be to like point out that actually there's a lot of places where this comes up in practice. I will mention that is not the only type of symmetries. This is just like the level 0 type. There are symmetries of the computation graph, automorphisms. And there's also more complicated things where you have to take into multiple layers into account, but I don't know too much about those. Okay, so maybe I will not go into too much detail on this, but I can come back if people are interested, or if people want to ask a question about it as I'm going through. But basically, we took a very mathematical view of this and defined something called the intertwiner group that sort of captures all of these symmetries that you have for that take this form of like I take a nonlinearity and I do something before it, and then I do something after it, and I get the same network. And the question is like, how do you construct these? Suppose I want to take my network and I want to do a bunch of transformations on the weights and get a bunch of equivalent networks whose weights look different. Well, what is a recipe to do this? And so we defined a map called phi that will tell me if I take a allowable transformation before the nonlinearity, how I can get a the appropriate pair transformation afterwards. And I will maybe not go through the math of this, but I will just leave you with like what these actually look like in practice. So the trivial case where the nonlinearity is the identity, of course, then you can do anything before that identity as long as you undo it afterwards. So you basically can apply any invertible matrix as long as you apply its inverse afterwards. Basically all of them you can do some sort of permutation, but sometimes you can do a little bit more. So it turns out like with ReLU, you not only can permute, you can also do scalings of individual nonlinearities as long as it's by a positive number. Because if I have if I multiply by a positive number before a ReLU, the ReLU won't do anything to that positive scaling, and afterwards I can multiply by 1 over the reciprocal of whatever that was and undo it. So we had a few other of these for instances, mostly to show that like you can do this more generally. And what I want to do now is say in my final maybe 10 minutes or so is say like why you should care about any of this. So for us, we were interested in sort of some of the math that went along with this for sure. But I train networks on much more applied problems in the other half of my life. So I'm always very curious whether this really matters at all. So I've been collecting instances where this sort of thing is important, and I will talk about 4 of them today. This covered in previous presentation. There was no previous presentation, so I'll say a little bit about it, but I'll focus maybe on the other 3. So the reason we were motivated to study this in the first place is because we were thinking about explainability of networks, and we were looking at the literature, and a lot of the explainability literature had this idea that you should, or implicitly assumed that you should look at the interpretability of neurons, individual neurons. And for me, this felt very wrong in some way, because it felt like you were picking a basis of a vector space. And as a mathematician, I was always told, you should not pick a basis unless you have to. You should work basis independent. And so my question for the explainability community, or actually for my postdoc, but in lieu of their explainability community, was like, why pick a neuron? Why not use a linear combination of neurons? After all, these are vector spaces. I can add neurons together. I can scale them. I can do things like that. And so Charlie went off and thought a lot about this, and came up with the idea that actually the nonlinearity sort of chooses a basis for you. And I guess in retrospect, like that doesn't seem so surprising, but it certainly didn't come to me when I was first thinking about this. So he wrote a theorem that basically says that for ReLU at least, the neurons are special exactly because ReLU chooses those neurons. Those neurons are decided by the ReLU function, and in fact, if I hand you a basis, you can rediscover the ReLU through or rediscover it ReLU through that basis. So, and it turns out this idea was not new to us. It had a name we were not aware of called privileged basis, and of course the privilegedness comes from the ReLU choosing what coordinates are important. And so an experimental observation, and this is sort of what led us down this path, was if you're doing interpretability on rich enough computer vision models or large language models, there's this phenomenon where like the coordinate axes or the neurons are more interpretable, and if you take a linear combination of them, on average it tends to be less interpretable from the metrics we have for measuring that. So maybe I look at like the first neuron that corresponds to dog, I look at the second neuron that corresponds to the color red. I take some linear combination of those, and it's kind of a mix of things, and it's hard to say what it actually is. And so we tried to measure this, and I will preface this by saying that ways of measuring interpretability of things are like very unsatisfying. It's a hard problem, but we did our best with it. I can say a little bit more about what this means if folks are interested, but essentially, in this case, the y-axis is a fraction of interpretable units. ResNet 50 final residual is after a nonlinearity, so this is a case where this privileged basis effect should hold. These other two networks are not after nonlinearities, either through modification or the architecture. And what you see is, as I travel along the x-axis and rotate the coordinate basis away from the neurons themselves, the fraction of interpretable units drops substantially until it's not much more than the models that don't have nonlinearities there, suggesting that yes, indeed, the nonlinearity is what causes this sort of accumulation of semantic content into individual neurons rather than kind of diffuse throughout the whole space. Interestingly, so for those who know this Anthropic Golden Gate Bridge paper, of course, in LLMs, the residual stream has no nonlinearities, and it has some nonlinearities that are like indirectly feeding into it, but there are none in that part of the network. And that's why that's one of several reasons you might want to do sparse autoencoders, if you're familiar with those. Okay, so that's interpretability. What are some other things? So symmetries of weights have an equivalent story in the loss landscape of networks. Like all those symmetries translate into features of the loss landscape. So the loss landscape has a lot of symmetries as well. There's been this observation that like in the right circumstances, you can actually interpolate between weights, not interpolate between the output, but like literally take two weight files and just average between them, each weight individually. And like surprisingly, you get a model that kind of has the properties of the two networks, or at least is not much worse. Given that neural network loss landscapes are non-convex, there is no reason this should be the case. And people were interested in this Git rebasin paper. They made the hypothesis that actually the only thing that's stopping you from being able to do this more generally is that the weights differ up to permutation. So the idea is like, maybe if we unpermute the weights, like align them right, we'll be able to average weights between networks, more diverse sets of networks, and still get something that works. And they were able to show this to some extent. I mean, it's all approximate. And the new conjecture is that is under certain circumstances, maybe same architecture, same training set, stuff like that, all SGG solutions are linearly connected. So I can travel from one to the other through the loss landscape on a linear path, and I don't encounter a high loss barrier as long as I'm willing to permute the layer, the weights of each. And so this is a recent paper on this that I thought was kind of nice, where they actually make this conjecture more rigorous. They also show that if I take two networks that have the same initialization but different independent training runs, I can take the final weights that I achieve, converged weights for both, and I can match them up as long as I'm willing to permute the rows / columns of one of them. But that same permutation I can actually do to all the checkpoints as well and get them to match up. So like not only are the final weights connected in a single loss basin, but the intermediate training steps I can also connect without having to go over a loss barrier by this same exact permutation, which is I think it's a nice result. So this is important if you want to merge models together. It's also important if you want to just be able to compare models. So we're sort of getting to an age where models are used in enough cases where sometimes people don't want to just like, I don't want to have a model, one model that works well and that's all I care about. Like I want to be able to have a catalog of them, and I want to be able to compare them, and I want to understand if one model is more similar to another than some third model. And so being able to compare models via their weights or their hidden activations is, of course, an active area of research. But that's a really hard problem if the models differ up to permutation. So understanding how to like align them before you compare them it can be really helpful. And then finally, there's this interesting area of research on learning on neural networks. And I'll close with this because this brings us back to the symmetries in data case. So there are various cases where people would want to be able to train a network to be able to predict things about neural networks. Maybe this is because you want to be able to evaluate the performance, evaluate properties of many networks without having to actually run them on data, or maybe you want to be able to look for backdoors. There's a lot of things people propose doing. I don't actually know if anyone's doing this in practice, like there's any practical problems that this is being currently used in. But it's certainly an interesting idea, and you can imagine in the future as neural networks proliferate around applications that you might, this might be something that comes up. And of course, in this case, like it's absolutely very important that you are able to capture weight symmetries, because when you're thinking about permutations, those are a whole lot bigger and more complicated group than just rotations of an image. And there you really do see an improvement when you build these into the network. I don't think we've got to the scale where you can just sort of learn from the data. And then finally, to kind of end, I'll just point out a paper that came out just in October, I guess, that I really liked, where they took all these ideas and they said, okay, well, let's mess up the symmetry and see if things fail. So they built networks that were where the symmetries I described no longer hold, by making the pointwise activations no longer equivalent. So each activation is a little different, or by snipping connections in the fully connected layer, so you can't really permute rows or columns anymore. And sure enough, they find like lots of things change. So lost landscape looks more convex. If you're trying to do these meta networks where you're learning on weights, suddenly the problem becomes much easier because you don't have to learn all these symmetries, and a few other things. So overall, I was really excited. I've been really excited to see this, because this little observation, which we were not the first to make, by the way, but we kind of put it down in a formal way, that seems like it may have no effect, actually has an impact on not only the way models behave, but things people might want to do with them. There's an optimization story here as well that I won't tell, but yeah, symmetries are important. They have real downstream impacts, and I think there's a lot of interesting and unanswered questions. There was already some good questions in this talk alone. So yeah, that's about all I have.
Thank you, Henry. Open the floor to questions. While we're waiting for the people to work their courage up, I've got a question. So
yeah, sure.
I was really struck by the comment about neural network loss landscapes. I'm actually wondering if should be that surprising though, because like if we assume that we have many more parameters than we have data points, which is typically the case, we can imagine the level set of the training of zero training loss as being a submanifold in the parameter space whose codimension is equal to the number of data points. So that submanifold is still going to be really high dimensional, and the codimension is going to be relatively low compared to the ambient dimension. So I'm imagining like the equivalent on like a really more visualizable number of dimensions would be like in 3D space. If you have a one-dimensional, a codim1 submanifold cutting the space, that would be like just like some two-dimensional surface inside three-dimensional space. Most points for, like obviously this will not be universally true, but it would be unsurprising if most points in each of the components cut by that curve were linearly connected.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, I guess it was like saying it's unsurprising. It depends on who you're talking to. When I gave this talk at the joint math meetings, and there was someone from, I don't remember what area of math, but it was very unsurprising to them. I think it is definitely one of these cases where our two-dimensional pictures probably don't help us out very well. To your point, I don't know if you've seen this paper. It's kind of old now, but there's a paper by Yaim Cooper, who is an algebraic geometer, who actually calculates under some somewhat toy conditions, calculates the dimension of or puts some bounds on the dimension of the zero set. And I don't remember if it aligns with what you just said, but it's in spirit the same sort of thing. Like it's much higher dimensional than you might think. And in practice, like these linear paths, like we say, they don't have an energy barrier. It's not like they're constant throughout the linear path. There is definitely a non-trivial little jump at some point. It's just not a huge difference. So yeah, I think that's probably the case. I mean, I would be interested in how it relates to some of the stuff that your edge stability work and things like that. The optimization, I don't know if you've seen this paper. The optimization story is like when you perform symmetry operations, and the ones they do are not the ones that I show. There's some other symmetries of weights. You preserve the loss because you have the same function, but it turns out you don't necessarily preserve the gradient. So what they do in their algorithm is they go along, and every once in a while they look around. They call it teleporting, to look around at gradients of equivalent different symmetry transformations of the weights, and try to find one that's better. And if it is better, then they teleport over there and continue their optimization or something like that. So I've never actually run the algorithm, but it's kind of a nice idea.
Yeah, I'll need to think about this some more. I did see the Get Rebasin paper when it came out, but I'm still sort of not really sure what to make of it. So
yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, we had him talk in the seminar I was running at the time, and it was a nice talk, but I think there's still a lot of questions around it.
Yeah. Other questions?
Did they have a method to find the the permutations to actually apply to align the weights?
Yeah, I think there's a few. I don't remember the details of their method. I know that when Charlie was doing this, he used some relaxation in order to make it actually, because otherwise it's not, of course, not feasible to find search permutations, because we're talking lots and big permutation groups. And so I'm not sure to what extent those results are limited by this not being a perfect optimization algorithm, but it's definitely where a lot of the work actually is to run these experiments.
All right. I was also curious with the pointwise nonlinearities and interpretability stuff. I think that maybe I missed it, but the curve for convex looked like it was going in the other direction. And I was wondering if that was true, or if you had any thoughts about that one. Why is this going up? And maybe we if residuals matter, if and then in transformers, of course, you've got KV compares that don't have a non-lit. Well, they do, to make those KVs event, but not in that particular comparison. I don't know. It seems like there's a lot here I'm not sure that's curious about.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. I mean, so
and I forgot what convex actually is. Actually, so maybe I could look, or I don't know if you remember, but I don't.
Yeah, I don't remember. So of course there's like a trade-off, right? When you work with real networks, they have a lot of other things going on with them. There's a lot of differences that we did not control for when running this. And also, like I mentioned that like measuring fraction of interpretable units is like sort of, to me at least, very unsatisfying the way it's done. I think the best way is we know how to do it. So, we did our best, but not perfect. Essentially, like you take some data set that has been, I think this was some image data set where you have pixel level annotations on everything. And then you look at something like how many of the units correlate to one type of object. Of course, there's lots of different types of objects, and there's things that probably aren't labeled in the network. So, and there's higher level concepts that maybe would have no label for a specific thing. So, they look at that alignment, and then they make some judgment about how many interpretable units there are. So really, this should say fraction of interpretable units that correspond to labels in this particular data set. So I don't know. It's a good question. I worry that it might just be something not interesting. But yeah, definitely something one could look into. Yeah.
Well, let's thank our speaker. And thank you very much, Henry, for being the first talk of the year. Very interesting talk, and
Thanks a lot for having me. Always happy to talk about machine learning.